The faded unit patch sat in her locker, Army Ranger insignia worn soft at the edges from a decade of being folded and refolded. Katie Rodriguez picked it up with 2 fingers, the cloth thin enough to see light through it now, and tucked it into the interior pocket of her jacket lining, the same place she'd sewn it 14 years ago outside Kandahar, back when her hands were steadier and her reasons for staying alive were simpler. She pressed it once, felt the slight thickness through the nylon, and closed the locker door quietly. The night shift at Oak Creek Memorial in Portland started at 11 p.m. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead, a sound that never quite turned off, just lowered itself into the background like tinnitus that everyone pretended not to hear. The ER moved with the organized chaos of a place that had learned long ago that the worst hours belonged to darkness. Katie moved through it invisible, the way she'd learned to move through everything for the past 30 days. This was her 30th night shift. She'd been counting. Her limp was barely visible if you weren't looking for it. The shrapnel in her left leg still sang sometimes, sharp bright notes of pain that felt like information, but she'd learned to walk around it, to distribute her weight in ways that made the injury disappear into normal human awkwardness. A slight favor to the right leg. A pause at the bottom of each stairwell that could have meant anything. Nothing that would make anyone stop and ask. She didn't want them to ask. The nurse's station sprawled across the center of the ER like command, but Katie stayed at the periphery, her badge clipped to her scrub pocket where it caught the harsh light and then fell back into shadow. She arranged the resupply cart with methodical precision, 4x4 gauze organized by the box, for catheters stacked by gauge size, the 14-gauge needles separated from the 18-gauge the way they needed to be. Her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, in places where doing it wrong meant someone didn't come home. At Oak Creek Memorial it just meant a nurse would have to come find supplies. Nobody thanked her for the cart. Dr. Ashford arrived at midnight, silver-haired and carrying himself like a man who had never once doubted his right to occupy space. He was 52, chief of surgery, built on 2 decades of board connections and an institutional reputation so thick it had calcified into something that felt like law. He moved through the ER the way a shark moves through water, purposeful, assumed authority, a kind of natural dominance that nobody questioned because questioning it would take more energy than just accepting it. Katie felt his attention land on her for exactly 2 seconds as she restocked the medication cart. She didn't look up. Looking up would be acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would be the start of being seen, and being seen was not part of her current strategy. The trauma alert came through at 12:47 a.m. Motor vehicle collision. For vehicles. Unconscious patient. ETA 5 minutes. The ER shifted into the organized precision that meant lives were about to hinge on what happened in the next 30 minutes. The attending physician, Dr. Chen, solid, middle-aged, competent, began assembling the team. Katie moved without being asked, her hands already reaching for the monitors, the pulse oximeter, the automated external defibrillator. She'd done this before. Not at Oak Creek Memorial, but in field hospitals outside Kandahar where the heat was so thick you could taste it like copper and the hours stretched until time stopped having meaning. The ambulance bay doors opened. The patient came in like urgent cargo, a male in his 60s with crush injuries from the driver's side door and a visible head laceration that was bleeding freely across the stretcher. They wheeled him into trauma bay 2, and the room contracted around him. Hands. Voices. The beeping of monitors climbing toward urgent as they hooked him to everything at once. Katie inserted the first line without being asked. 18-gauge angiocath, inserted at 45 degrees into the antecubital vein, blood returning red and immediate. The line was in place in 4 seconds. She moved like muscle memory, like her hands remembered a life her mind was trying to forget. The cardiac monitor showed sinus rhythm for 14 seconds and then the line went flat. Cardiac arrest. Dr. Chen called compressions. Katie was already moving. She placed her hands on the patient's sternum, aligned her shoulders directly above his chest, and began the steady rhythm, firm, fast, mechanical. 100 compressions per minute. 67 kilograms of force every push. Her shoulders drove the compressions from a place that had nothing to do with conscious thought. She'd kept people alive like this in the dark. She'd kept soldiers breathing with her hands on their chests while helicopters circled and Taliban fire chewed up the canvas above them. The compressions continued for 2 minutes. The monitor showed nothing but flat line. Dr. Chen called for medication, 1 mg epinephrine intravenous, and Katie watched Chen's hands shake slightly as he pushed the drug. Newer doctors always had some tremor in their hands during codes. It was normal. It meant they understood the weight of what they were doing. Katie's hands never shook. She maintained compressions. Her breathing stayed steady. Her eye contact stayed level. And across the trauma bay, through the noise and the urgency and the organized chaos of 6 people trying to reverse the moment when a human body decided to stop working, Dr. Ashford watched her. He was standing near the monitor, ostensibly checking the patient's numbers. But his attention was on her hands. On the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this too many times to second-guess her own movements. On the way she anticipated the rhythm without the monitor telling her when to count. On the slight tilt of her head that suggested she was listening to something, the patient's chest, maybe, or just the rhythm her own body had settled into. For minutes of compressions, the monitor showed a return of spontaneous circulation. The patient's heart decided to beat again. The compression stopped. The patient gasped once, twice, and his oxygen saturation climbed, 72, 84, 91, as the ventilator pushed oxygen into lungs that had almost forgotten how to use it. Dr. Ashford looked away first. The patient stabilized enough for transfer to the ICU. Dr. Chen touched Katie's shoulder as she stepped back from the bed, a brief acknowledgement that he'd seen her work and understood what competence looked like under pressure. She nodded once, the way soldiers nod to each other after surviving something that could have gone the other way. By the time the patient was gone and the trauma bay was being restocked, Dr. Ashford was already moving toward his next task, already dismissing what he'd seen as a function of her job description. She was a nurse. The patient had survived. The code had been run efficiently. Everything had worked according to protocol. There was nothing unusual in any of it. Katie washed her hands for the second time since the code, the water hot enough to make her skin flush. She could see the faint scars along her knuckles, small pale lines that had come from surgical procedures that required absolute precision, stitched with obsessive care by an army medic who understood that his hands were going to be the difference between someone's daughter coming home and someone's family getting a folded flag. She pressed her fingers into the creases of her palms and held them there, maintaining pressure. The night moved forward. Fractures were set. Lacerations were sutured. A woman came in complaining of chest pain and left for hours later with medication and the phone number for a cardiologist. A child arrived with a fever and left with his mother's hand wrapped around his small fingers. The ER ran like it had been running for 100 years, like it would run the same way for 100 more. Katie moved through it all like a ghost that understood exactly where it was supposed to be. At 3 a.m., the life flight helicopter landed on the roof. The sound came first, a low rhythmic pounding that moved through the building like a heartbeat. Katie was restocking the medication cabinet in the break room, arranged alphabetically, each vial positioned with its label facing forward. The helicopter's rotor wash shook the windows. The sound climbed, that distinctive mechanical thunder that meant somewhere out there someone had been broken badly enough to require a level 1 trauma center 45 minutes away by car. Katie's jaw tightened. Her hands, carefully positioned around an ampule of midazolam, didn't shake. Her breathing didn't accelerate. Her body didn't betray her with any of the tells that would give away the fact that her entire nervous system had just registered that sound as a threat equivalent to incoming fire. She finished arranging the medication, closed the cabinet door quietly, and stood there in the fluorescent silence until the helicopter sound faded into something that could almost pass for wind. Just wind. Just a machine. Just a sound that happened every night and meant nothing except that someone else's life was about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Dr. Ashford passed her in the hallway at 6:15 a.m., on his way to morning rounds, already carrying 3 charts and the weight of his reputation like something he'd sewn into his coat lining the way you might carry something precious. He stopped, not quite at her but in her vicinity, and his voice came out even, measured, institutional, the voice of someone who had never been questioned in his own hospital. "The compression's in trauma too," he said. "Who trained you?" Katie's response came quietly, deferentially, the way she'd learned to make her voice small enough that it wouldn't draw attention. "Army medical training, Doctor. Years ago." He nodded, processing this information and already filing it away as irrelevant. Military training was fine. It meant she followed protocol. It meant she understood hierarchy. It meant she could be useful without asking questions or demanding recognition. "Adequate work," he said. "Don't develop any ideas about your own importance in this hospital. Nurses are essential but interchangeable. Remember that." "Yes, Doctor." He continued toward the elevators, his morning rounds waiting, his reputation intact, his authority unquestioned. Katie stood in the hallway for a moment after he'd passed, her hands clasped loosely at her waist. She could feel the medication cart waiting to be restocked. She could feel the next 12 hours waiting to be lived. She could feel the unit patch, still tucked safely inside her jacket lining, reminding her of a woman she used to be. She went back to work. By end of shift, Katie had documented everything perfectly. Her charting was meticulous, vital signs recorded to the minute, medication times logged, observations noted with clinical precision. She filled out forms like she was writing someone else's story. Each entry was accurate and invisible. Each note contributed to a medical record that would exist long after everyone involved had forgotten her name. The night shift ended at 7 a.m. The day shift arrived with coffee and fresh energy and the assumption that Oak Creek Memorial would continue running the way it always had, with competent staff executing protocols and heroes wearing their reputations like medals pinned to their chests. Katie clocked out quietly. She was 30 days into this job and still nobody knew her name, really. They knew she was capable. They knew she anticipated equipment needs. They knew her compressions never broke sternum bone and her medication calculations were always exact. But they didn't know her. They didn't ask. And she preferred it that way. The faded unit patch was still there in her jacket lining, a small soft weight that nobody else would ever notice, carrying the memory of a woman who had been Major Katie Rodriguez, Viper to the soldiers who'd depended on her, legend to the ones who'd survived what she survived. That woman was folded and pressed and hidden and safe. For now, she was just a nurse. Just Katie, the new girl on the night shift who kept her head down and did her job and never mentioned why her hands didn't tremble or why helicopters made something dark and careful shift behind her eyes. Just invisible. Just safe. But that wasn't going to last. The patient's kidneys were shutting down at 15% function, and Dr. Ashford was about to poison him. Katie saw it on the afternoon labs before the code even started. Creatinine climbing. Potassium elevated. The renal panel screaming what anyone with 2 years of nursing school could read. When the monitor alarm shrieked and the patient went into VTAC, she was already moving, muscle memory took over, hands reaching for the crash cart, calling compressions like breathing. The team assembled around the bed with the precision of people who'd done this 1,000 times. Someone called rhythm. Someone else charged the defibrillator. The patient's chest arched against the current. His heart came back. Dr. Ashford arrived 3 minutes later, still wearing his $2,000 Italian leather shoes and the expression of a man who'd never been questioned. He scanned the monitor, glanced at the lab someone had clipped to the foot of the bed, and gave his order without hesitation. Push magnesium. 1 gram 4. Now. Katie's hands stopped moving. She wasn't the charge nurse. She wasn't the attending. She was supposed to follow the order, draw it up, administer it, and say nothing. That was the job. That was always the job. But her muscle memory was military, not civilian, trained in a field hospital outside Kandahar where a contraindicated drug meant someone didn't come home, and before she could stop herself, she stepped forward. Doctor, the labs show kidney function at 15%. Magnesium could. Are you the physician, Nurse Rodriguez? The question landed with the weight of a gavel. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence where you hear the ventilator hissing and the monitor beeping and the fluorescent lights overhead humming their electronic drone. 12 staff members stopped what they were doing. Every eye in the trauma bay turned. Katie took one measured breath. "No, sir." "Then you're going to draw it up, and you're going to push it, and you're not going to speak again unless I ask you a direct question. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir." She drew the medication. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. The vial was cool in her palm. The syringe clicked into place. She pushed the plunger and watched the magnesium disappear into the fall line. 20 minutes later, the patient's heart rhythm deteriorated in exactly the sequence she'd known it would. Blood pressure dropped. O2 sat plummeted. The team scrambled to save him, but his kidneys couldn't process what Ashford had forced into his veins, and the damage was irreversible. They got him stabilized enough to admit to ICU, but Katie knew the truth written in his vitals. The man upstairs was dying in slow motion, and Dr. Ashford had handed him a weapon. He didn't acknowledge her. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look at her as he stripped off his gloves and left the trauma bay. But he was keeping track. That was the thing about men like Ashford, their egos didn't forgive being right. They only forgave being in control. 2 hours later, the overhead speaker crackled to life across 3 floors. Katie was restocking the crash cart when she heard her name echo through the hospital like a bell tolling. "Would Rodriguez, our know-it-all newbie from night shift, please report to the Chief of Surgery's office?" That's Rodriguez, the nurse who thinks she went to medical school. Conversation stopped. 30 staff members looked up from their work. Someone snickered. Someone else pretended to cough to cover a laugh. Katie registered their faces, the sympathy from the residents, the carefully neutral expression from the charge nurse, the barely concealed satisfaction from the 2 attending physicians who'd been waiting for Ashford to make an example of someone. She set down the ambu bag she was holding, wiped her hands on a paper towel, and walked the corridor toward the administrative wing. The hallway seemed to extend forever, each fluorescent panel stretching toward Ashford's office like a walk to execution. But she didn't make it to his office. He intercepted her outside the stairwell, grabbing her elbow and pulling her into a supply closet between the pharmacy and the break room. The door closed with a soft click. Metal shelves lined with gauze and antiseptic and for tubing surrounded them in the half-light. Ashford stood inches from her face, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and the expensive cologne that couldn't mask the sweat of adrenaline. "You're on probation, sweetheart. 1 word from me and you're scanning groceries." His voice came out quiet. That was the scariest part. Not loud. Not angry. Just controlled, like he was explaining something simple to a child. "I don't care what hospital you worked at before. I don't care what you think you know. Here, you're nobody. You follow MY orders or you leave. You question me again, and I will have you out of this building before your shift ends. Understood?" Katie didn't blink. Her jaw tightened, just slightly, not enough for him to see unless he was looking for it. She was looking for it. A single tear escaped from her left eye. She didn't try to stop it. She just reached up with her steady hand and wiped it away without breaking eye contact, her fingers moving with the precision of someone who'd held herself together through far worse than this. "I've served under worse than you, Doctor." His face reddened. His hand moved toward her shoulder, then stopped. She'd already turned away, opening the supply closet door before he could respond, and she walked back down the hallway while his breathing came hard behind her. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. She moved like someone who'd learned that fear was only dangerous if you let it show. The real punishment came the next morning. Katie had worked night shift for 30 days straight, and she'd never once encountered Dr. Ashford at 7 a.m. when the day's shift arrived. But he was waiting in the parking lot as she came out of the employee entrance, still wearing her scrubs from the night, a uniform bag slung over her shoulder. The morning was overcast, Portland gray threatening rain. A cluster of arriving physicians stood near the badge reader, maybe 15 of them, fresh and awake and dressed in their street clothes before changing into white coats. Ashford saw her. He smiled. That was the worst part, the smile, like he was about to deliver a gift. "Rodriguez, he called out, his voice carrying across the concrete lot like a stage announcement. "Everyone, this is Nurse Rodriguez. She's going to be transitioning to basic patient care effective immediately." Katie stopped walking. She could feel every eye on her. "From now on, Rodriguez, you'll be handling bedpans, patient baths, vital sign checks. Nothing that requires decision-making. I think some humility will do you good. Maybe it'll teach you about respecting the chain of command." Someone snickered. Someone else looked away, suddenly very interested in their phone. The arriving physicians exchanged glances, the kind of looks that said they'd been expecting something like this, that Ashford had probably called some of them already, had already rewritten the narrative so that Katie was the problem, the know-it-all, the overreaching newbie who'd finally been put in her place. Katie said nothing. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. Her leg ached from 10 hours of standing, the phantom pain in the scar tissue from the IED shrapnel still embedded in her spine flaring in response to stress. She could feel Ashford's satisfaction radiating across the parking lot like heat. She turned and walked toward her car with her posture perfect, spine straight, gait even despite the limp, every muscle controlled. She sat in the driver's seat for 5 minutes before starting the engine. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white. In the rearview mirror, she could see Dr. Ashford holding court with the arriving physicians, gesturing toward her car, moving his hands like he was conducting an orchestra. He'd already rewritten the entire code incident. By noon, half the hospital would believe that Katie had questioned him unnecessarily, that she was a troublemaker, that Ashford had been merciful in not firing her on the spot. She started the car and pulled out of the lot, watching his silhouette shrink in the mirror until Portland's morning traffic swallowed her vehicle into the grey. 3 nights later, Katie was on the orthopedic floor doing what she'd been demoted to do, emptying bedpans from post-surgical hip replacements and bringing ice water to patients who'd lost their appetite. The work was beneath her. It was meant to be. The indignity was the point. She accepted it without comment, moved through the corridor with her hands full of things that didn't matter, and tried very hard not to think about the field hospital in Kandahar where she'd been holding lives together while bombs landed close enough to make the ground shake. Then the sirens wailed. An ambulance, then another, then a third, the sound of emergency arriving outside the ER doors on the first floor. Katie heard the commotion through the stairwell, the muffled urgency of voices calling for the trauma team. She kept moving. Not her job. Not anymore. She was emptying bedpans. That was her assignment. That was all she got to be. But then she heard an ER physician shouting something that made her feet stop moving. GCS of 5. Unequal pupils. Found him seizing in the hotel room. The words unlocked something in her chest. She set down the bedpan she was holding and moved toward the stairwell. She knew she shouldn't. She knew Ashford would destroy her if he found out. But her body was already moving, her military training overriding her civilian probation, and by the time she reached the first floor, she was already in the hallway outside the trauma bay, watching paramedics wheel in an unconscious man on a stretcher. 43 years old. Civilian clothes. A name on his ID card that made time stop. Marcus Webb. Katie's breath caught. She moved deeper into the hallway, positioning herself where she could see the monitor but where Ashford wouldn't see her. The patient's head was wrapped in emergency bandages, blood soaking through the gauze. His pupils were blown wide. One bigger than the other, a sign of something pushing against his brain, something catastrophic. The ER physician was calling out vitals while a resident cut away his shirt. ICP climbing. Heart rate dropping. The telltale signs of a brain bleed expanding with every passing second. CT results. Dr. Ashford's voice cut through the chaos as he arrived, still radiating the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong. Traumatic brain injury, intracranial hemorrhage, significant edema, the radiologist answered. He needs emergency decompression. Neurosurgeon? In Seattle at a conference. For hours minimum ETA. Dr. Ashford looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. Katie could see the calculation happening behind his eyes: risk assessment, liability analysis, the weighing of one unconscious man's life against his own institutional reputation. She'd seen that look before, in other hospitals, in other rooms, but never directed at someone she knew. Too risky without the specialist, Ashford announced. We stabilize and wait. Push mannitol, keep him sedated. Get him upstairs to ICU. The ER physician's face went red. With ICP rising at this rate, for hours. Then he should have bled in Seattle, Ashford snapped. The team moved to obey, drawing up medication, preparing the patient for transfer. Katie watched Captain Marcus Webb's monitor, the man who'd sat at a table in a sand-colored tent in Kandahar and signed the paperwork that ended her military career. The man who'd looked her in the eye during the court-martial and said that heroism didn't excuse insubordination. His intracranial pressure was 38 and climbing. At 40, irreversible damage would begin. At 45, his brain would start to die. Dr. Ashford was turning to leave when he noticed her. His face hardened. Rodriguez, didn't I reassign you to basic care? Get back to ortho. Now. Katie didn't move. She was staring at the man on the stretcher, at the monitor, at the numbers that meant something was happening that no one else in this hospital could see. She could see it. She could see it perfectly clearly. The ICP climbing. The time running out. The specialist for hours away. The calculation that Ashford had made and gotten catastrophically wrong. She could see Captain Marcus Webb dying, one brain bleed at a time, while she folded bedpans 2 floors above. 3 nights later, Katie stood in the orthopedic ward on the 4th floor of Oak Creek Memorial, folding fitted sheets into squares that would never be perfectly square, because the linen cart was ancient and the sheets had shrunk 40 times over. Bedpan duty. That was what Ashford had called it, though the demotion extended to everything: changing soiled linens, restocking supplies, the invisible work of keeping floors functional while the real nurses, the ones with unquestioned obedience, moved through rooms 3 doors at a time. She had been a major in the 75th Ranger Regiment. She had held a field hospital open for 11 hours under Taliban fire with 2 full lines, a prayer, and hands that didn't shake even when the shrapnel started singing. Now she was folding sheets. The fluorescent fixture overhead buzzed like something dying slowly, deliberately. The windows of Oak Creek Memorial faced northeast toward the city, and she didn't have to turn around to hear what came next: the first ambulance siren, thin and distant, then a second one joining like harmony in a minor key. Then a third. Katie kept folding. Not her department. Not her patient. Not her responsibility. The sirens climbed higher, closer, the way sirens did when something bad had happened to someone important. She had learned not to care about those distinctions anymore. But her hands stopped folding. The trauma radio hung on the wall of the orthopedic station, and the ER physician's voice crackled through it with the specific urgency reserved for the cases that changed people's entire weeks, sometimes their entire careers. Incoming GSW to the head, approximately 2 centimeters above the right orbit, entry wound with clear skull fracture, patient actively seizing in the ambulance, seizure started 3 minutes ago, seizure duration now for minutes, still active, we have 2 large bore 4s running normal saline wide open, patient was found unresponsive at a motel on Burnside at 2,133 hours. The orthopedic nurse, Janet, knew enough to still get excited about calls, looked up from her desk. That's going to be a mess. Katie moved toward the radio without deciding to move. Her body had made a decision her mind was still processing. GSW to the head. Active seizures meant elevated intracranial pressure, brain swelling, the kind of injury that could convert a person into something else entirely in the span of 3 minutes. The seizure was the brain's way of screaming that it was suffocating in its own swelling. ETA 2 minutes, the ER physician continued. We're going to need neurosurgery standing by, we're going to need CT immediately, we're going to need, there was a pause. A single second of silence. Then, Captain Marcus Webb. Patient is Captain Marcus Webb, active duty Army Ranger, no allergies, medical record probably at Fort Lewis or Walter Reed, contact military liaison for. Katie's hand froze on the fabric of another fitted sheet. Her fingers had gone absolutely still. Muscle memory had nothing to do with it. Captain Marcus Webb, the presiding officer at her court-martial in Kandahar. The man whose signature had ended her military career. The officer who sat across from her in that room with the soundproof walls and the single overhead light and read the charges aloud as if he was ordering lunch: reckless endangerment, violation of ROE, unauthorized field procedure on a civilian casualty, while Katie sat in dress uniform and never blinked, never moved, never said a single word in her own defense, because there was no defense that mattered once the politics were already decided. The same officer who was currently seizing in an ambulance somewhere near Portland's east side, his brain bleeding into itself. Janet was still talking. That's going to be a neurosurgery case for sure. They'll probably call Ashford. He always wants the high-profile stuff. Did you see that his picture was in the hospital newsletter last month? Next to some donor he'd been schmoozing. Katie set the sheets down. She was moving toward the stairs before she could process why. Her body was a different person than her mind. Her body had spent years responding to situations the mind was still thinking through. The stairs down to the emergency department took 90 seconds. The ER doors opened inward with their automatic sense, and the space inside was already chaos, the specific controlled chaos of a trauma coming in hot. They wheeled him through the entrance at 2,149 hours. Katie could see him before anyone else moved. Captain Webb on the stretcher, unconscious, his body locked in a full-body seizure, every muscle contracted against itself as if he was trying to squeeze out of his own skin. His right eye socket was swollen shut. Blood ran from his right ear, the marker of intracranial pressure building like pressure in a sealed container. The seizure was still running. His jaw was clenched so hard she could see the tendons standing out in his neck like cables. Dr. Ashford emerged from his office as if the ambulance sirens were a summons written specifically for him. He was already moving, already speaking in that voice like a tank idling in a garage, low and heavy and capable of crushing anything in its path. Trauma Bay 3. 2 large bore 4s, get me a full trauma panel, CBC, comprehensive metabolic, type and cross for 4 units. He was moving alongside the stretcher, not so much examining the patient as observing him from a distance, the way a lion observes prey, cataloguing weakness, measuring resistance. Katie stood near the medication cabinet and watched. She had learned weeks ago that watching was what probationary nurses on bedpan duty were supposed to do. Stand still. Be invisible. Don't voice opinions. Don't question. Don't even exist in the room except as a set of hands when someone needed something folded or cleaned. The seizure finally stopped at 2,153 hours. For minutes and 20 seconds of uncontrolled electrical activity in a brain that was already swelling against the rigid constraints of a skull. The moment the convulsion stopped, the monitors told the story: blood pressure dropping, heart rate erratic, the specific pattern of a consciousness leaving the building 1 floor at a time. The CT came back in 7 minutes. Ashford studied the images on the monitor, his face illuminated by blue light and something else, something that might have been calculation. Intracranial pressure at 32 mm mercury, the radiologist reported over the phone. Significant midline shift. Subarachnoid hemorrhage, epidural bleed, intraparenchymal hemorrhage across 3 separate zones. This patient needs surgical decompression within the hour or we're looking at permanent neurological damage. Minimum intervention is burr hole decompression for ICP relief. Full craniotomy is indicated, but when is neurosurgery available? Ashford's voice cut through the rest like a wire. Dr. Morrison is finishing an aneurysm case. ETA approximately 4 hours. 4 hours. Katie watched the number land on Ashford's face and saw his expression shift into something she recognized from Kandahar, the expression of a man doing the calculation. Webb was a captain. Webb had rank. Webb's hospital admission would generate paperwork, military liaison, possibly joint commission review, possibly attention. Attention was bad for departments that performed 3 percentage points below national average in mortality rates for trauma cases. Ashford set the phone down and turned to the ER physician. Continue current supportive measures. Elevated head of bed 30 degrees, maintain sedation, push another dose of mannitol. We maintain conservative care until neurosurgery is available. This patient is too high acuity for experimental intervention. He said the word experimental the way some people said contaminated. Katie was still standing near the medication cabinet. She wasn't supposed to be in the trauma bay at all. Probationary nurses on bedpan duty didn't stand in trauma bays. But her feet hadn't moved and her eyes didn't move away from the monitor where Captain Webb's ICP was climbing toward the threshold of no return. The ER physician, Chen, a resident who still had honest eyes, looked between Ashford and the patient and then, for a fraction of a second, looked at Katie. Not looking at her. Looking through the space where she was standing, at something he was trying to process. If someone has field experience. She's a nurse, Ashford said, and the word came out sharp as sterile instruments. A probationary nurse currently on bedpan duty. She has no field experience. She has no surgical credentials. She has nothing except an inability to follow the hierarchy that exists for specific reasons. He turned to the room. Clear the bay. We have other patients. This one stays sedated and monitored until Morrison arrives. The room entered the way rooms do when an authority figure speaks with the weight of a career behind his voice. Katie stood still. The monitors continued their dual rhythm, the ventilator's mechanical wheeze and the heart monitor's steady beat that was getting less steady by the minute. Captain Webb's face had relaxed into unconsciousness, but unconsciousness at an ICP of 35 mm mercury wasn't the same as sleep. It was the beginning of the end. She had seen this before. She had felt this calculation before. Once, in a compound outside Jalalabad, a colonel refused to let her do an emergency thoracotomy on a civilian woman because the political optics were complicated. That woman's heart had stopped 3 minutes later. Katie had felt the woman's last heartbeat against her palm. She stepped forward. Not a decision. A statement. I volunteer to stay with him. Ashford turned. His eyes were grey as concrete. Excuse me. For hours until the neurosurgeon arrives. Someone needs to be monitoring his intracranial pressure, checking his pupils, watching for signs of further deterioration. I can stay with him. I can do that. Ashford studied her the way a predator studies prey that has just made an unexpected move. Katie could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This was an opportunity. This was a probationary nurse on bedpan duty who was about to fail catastrophically with a high-profile military patient. This was documentation waiting to be written. This was justification for every decision he'd already made about her. Fine, he said, and his voice carried the weight of a trap closing. Your responsibility. Everyone else, out. We have other patients. He turned away before Katie could respond, already moving toward the door, already reaching for his phone. Katie pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves. The snap of the latex was the only sound left in the room. Captain Webb's ICP was climbing toward 38. The monitor beeped its warning, a rhythm that said time was running out. Through the glass window of the trauma bay, she saw Ashford in the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, his back to the window, his voice low and measured and carrying the specific tone of a man building a case. She didn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She had heard this voice before. She had stood in front of this voice in Kandahar. She had heard it sign documents that ended her career. This time, she was ready. Katie shutters the trauma room door and the fluorescent hum of Oak Creek Memorial falls away. No more probationary nurse. No more keeping her hand still. The mask slides off like combat gear stripped after a mission, and what remains is Viper, the combat medic who held a field hospital for 11 hours under Taliban fire, the woman who learned to read a skull fracture the way other people read their own names. Captain Marcus Webb lies motionless on the trauma bed, his monitor screaming. The intracranial pressure sits at 35 mm of mercury, the threshold where brain death begins its quiet work. Each heartbeat pushes fluid into a space with nowhere to go, crushing grey matter against bone. The numbers climbing on the screen are a countdown. Katie knows by instinct he has hours before the damage becomes irreversible. Not 4. Not 5. Hours measured in minutes now. She doesn't call for help. She doesn't page Ashford. She moves instead with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who has done this in darkness, in caves, in field hospitals where the only light came from a headlamp clamped between her teeth. Her hands pull the crash cart close, the metal frame squeaks against linoleum, a sound like a Black Hawk roto wash, familiar in ways civilian hospitals will never understand. From the surgical tray she selects a scalpel with the careful attention a sniper gives to scope calibration. Her fingers wrap around it like an old conversation. Muscle memory takes over, a phrase too small for what actually happens. This is something deeper. This is DNA speaking in a voice older than words. She palpates his skull, finding the fracture line with fingertips that have done this before under mortar fire, under conditions that would make civilian surgeons weep. The bone feels wrong, depressed, pushing inward. The bruising beneath his right temple is already purple-black, swelling that will squeeze the brain like a fist closing on a bird. She marks the burr site with a marker pen, her touch precise as a tattoo artist. 2 centimeters above his right temple. 4 millimeters behind the hairline. She has performed this procedure in a bombed-out schoolhouse with her last 2 units of whole blood, in a cave where the Taliban was calling in coordinates to mortar teams, in the back of a Humvee during extraction with incoming fire painting the darkness orange. She can do it here, in climate control, with actual surgical equipment, with time on her side like a luxury. The scalpel bites through skin. No tremor. No hesitation. The blood wells red and immediate, and she controls it with gauze held at an angle, pressure without grinding, a technique they don't teach in civilian nursing school because civilian nursing school doesn't prepare you for keeping someone alive when the building is collapsing. She cuts through the temporalis muscle with surgical precision, peeling the tissue back to expose bone. The burr, the actual drill bit that would normally require authorization from the chief of surgery, sits in her equipment bag. She never filed it. Never checked it into the hospital system. Never let it touch the official inventory. A 12mm titanium burr, the kind used in field hospitals when power is unreliable and you need manual control more than you need protocol. She positions it against the skull and begins the rotation, slow, steady, feeling for the moment when resistance shifts. The bone dust rises like desert sand, and she breathes it in without flinching. 3 minutes into the procedure, his ICP drops from 35 to 32. The monitor alarm changes pitch, still urgent, but no longer announcing imminent death. She adjusts his head position, tilting the bed 20 degrees to promote venous drainage, a trick she learned from a trauma surgeon in Helmand province who died 3 months later in an ambush. She performs it anyway. She performs all of it anyway. The hours collapse into a rhythm. Katie maintains the burr hole manually, monitoring the flow of cerebrospinal fluid with the same attention she once gave to rifle distances and muzzle flashes. At the 2-hour mark, Webb's intracranial pressure sits at 28. Still elevated, but no longer apocalyptic. His pupils respond to light, reactive, equal, round. His breathing steadies. The seizure activity that was fibrillating across the EEG quiets to occasional spikes. She titrates his medications in combinations that exist nowhere in the hospital's standard protocols: phenytoin for seizure prophylaxis, osmotic agents to reduce cerebral edema, sedatives calculated for a man with brain trauma whose body is responding to her hands the way soldiers responded under fire, with the kind of trust that has no words. Somewhere in the second hour, Dr. Ashford appears at the trauma room window. He watches for exactly 20 minutes. Katie sees him in her peripheral vision, a silhouette framed against the hallway lights, his face unreadable. She doesn't acknowledge him. She doesn't slow her work or explain her hands or justify the burr hole or the manual procedures or any of the interventions that would require forms and signatures and his permission. She simply continues, the way she continued in Kandahar when authorization structures collapsed along with the concrete walls around the field hospital. At the 90-minute mark, Ashford steps away from the window. Katie hears him before she sees him, the soft click of his phone opening, the murmur of his voice through the trauma room door, words she doesn't strain to understand. She knows what's happening. She's seen it before in different uniforms, different settings, the same pattern of institutional self-preservation. He's making calls. He's protecting himself. He's building the documentation that will prove she was never supposed to be in this room doing this work. At hour 3, Katie notices the attending physician hasn't checked vitals in 80 minutes. The man who was monitoring Webb when she took over is gone, reassigned, transferred, disappeared into some other emergency that suddenly demanded his presence. She checks the ICU transfer request she submitted at the 2-hour mark. The system shows authorization required. Nobody has authorized it. Nobody will. She understands what's being constructed. She's watched good soldiers court-martialed for saving lives with the wrong paperwork. She's seen brilliant doctors stripped of licenses for emergency procedures performed outside protocol. She knows the shape of this narrative because she's lived it before, and this time she's chosen her ground deliberately. She's in a room. She has a patient. She has 4 hours that stretch like eternity and disappear like minutes. At the 3-hour 20-minute mark, Captain Webb's vital signs improve past what should be possible. His blood pressure climbs to 98/60. His heart rate drops to 84. His pupils are brisk. The CT scan Katie pulls up on the workstation shows the swelling has plateaued. The hemorrhage has stopped enlarging. The brain damage has paused its advance, arrested not by the neurosurgeon who hasn't arrived but by the woman in the trauma room who was probationary and powerless and is now something else entirely. She reaches for her jacket, folded on the chair where she left it when she understood she was walking into the room where her court-martial officer was dying. She pulls the unit patch from the inside pocket. Faded desert tan, the colors worn to ghosts by time and sand and the kind of sweat that comes from holding people together while the world tries to tear them apart. Viper. The call sign she earned, the identity she buried, the name Captain Marcus Webb knew her by when she was keeping his unit alive under fire. She reaches into Webb's jacket on the bedside table and opens the lining with careful hands. She sews the patch inside with needle and thread she finds in the crash cart, black suture material, precise stitches, the kind of invisible reinforcement that holds things together from the inside where nobody sees. She doesn't know why she does this. The medic in her understands nothing but blood pressure and intracranial pressure and the mathematics of survival. But something older than training, something that remembers what it meant to have unit patches sewn into jacket linings, something that recognizes the man on the bed as someone she held alive once before, that part of her needs him to know she was here. Not as probationary. Not as subordinate. As Viper. The neurosurgeon arrives at the 4-hour mark, walking into the trauma room like someone stepping into a story that's already written its ending. His name is Dr. Raymond Chen, 53 years old, trained at Johns Hopkins, the kind of specialist that hospitals beg to consult on their most complex cases. He stops. He stares at the patient. He stares at the chart. He stares at Katie, who is still standing beside the bed with the steady calm of someone who has done this work in places where the neurosurgeon doesn't arrive for 11 hours because there is no neurosurgeon, there's just you and your hands and 16 soldiers who are counting on you not to fail. Who did this? Dr. Chen asks, his voice carrying the tone of someone watching a miracle and trying to understand the mechanics. Katie begins to answer, but she doesn't get the chance. Dr. Ashford enters behind the specialist like a shadow following light, his composure reassembled, his institutional armor pulled back into place. Nurse Rodriguez. Without authorization, he says, and his voice is perfectly measured, perfectly professional, perfectly lethal. Dr. Chen, as you can see, the patient has been stabilized, though the procedures were performed beyond the nurse's scope of practice. Katie removes her badge from her neck, the plastic card that says her name and her probationary status and her permission to exist in this hospital. She walks to the nurse station and sets it down with the same precision she once used to surrender her officer's bars to the military tribunal that ended her career. She doesn't argue. She doesn't explain Kandahar or field hospitals or the 16 soldiers before the blast or the shrapnel still embedded in her spine or any of the calculus that brought her here to save the man who signed the papers that court-martialed her. She simply removes her scrubs from the locker and changes into civilian clothes in the break room, while upstairs her monitor shows steady rhythms and normal vital signs and a captain who is breathing on his own. That evening, Katie returns her scrubs to the hospital laundry in the basement, where the industrial washers hum like helicopter rotors and the air tastes like bleach and steam. She folds the blue fabric one final time, left corner, right corner, the way you fold things you're never wearing again. The laundry supervisor, a kind woman named Marie who's worked at Oak Creek for 19 years, looks up from her sorting station. "You're a good nurse, honey," Marie says, the kind of observation that carries the weight of watching people for 2 decades. "Good ones always leave first." Katie nods once. She doesn't correct her. She doesn't explain that she was never just a nurse, that she's held more lives in her hands than most surgeons will see, that she performed field thoracotomies while people tried to kill her, that she saved 16 soldiers before an IED took her leg and ended the career she rebuilt into this blue scrub and this hospital badge and this moment of walking out into the Portland rain. The weight of invisibility settles over her like dust. She walks to her car without looking back at the hospital that rises behind her like a monument to the kind of institutions that break people for saving lives with the wrong paperwork. The rain hammers the parking lot like applause nobody's meant to hear. Dr. Ashford locks himself in his office for 30 minutes while Katie's hands are still moving in the trauma room, strategy collapsing into panic. The rational part of his mind, the part that built a 20-year career on institutional maneuvering, recognizes what's happening. Captain Marcus Webb is waking up. Webb will talk. And when he does, Katie Rodriguez ceases to be a probationary nurse who violated protocol and becomes something far more dangerous, a witness with rank and credibility and the kind of military connections that don't disappear. His fingers hover over the personnel database. One keystroke and he can begin reframing the narrative before the board members pull her complete file. His administrator credentials grant him access that no board member possesses. The HR director, Janet Kowalski, who's navigated 12 years of his strategic preferences, picks up on his first call. "We need to document Rodriguez's performance issues," Ashford says, his voice smooth and administrative. "Her file needs to reflect the concerns that led to termination." Janet's voice carries uncertainty. "Doctor, if she's actually a military officer. Her rank doesn't matter. Protocol matters." The words come with the weight of institutional authority. He hangs up before she can object again. The next 2 hours become a careful exercise in digital destruction. Ashford adds fabricated performance warnings to Katie's file, backdates incident reports to her first week, marks her down for insubordination on shifts where she performed flawlessly. Each entry uses language so bureaucratic, so perfectly calibrated to hospital policy language, that no one reading it would question the documentation. He doesn't know that every keystroke logs his administrator credentials. He doesn't know that hospital security systems automatically timestamp every file access and alteration. He doesn't know that his attempts to cover his tracks are actually creating evidence. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part comes when he realizes that digital trails alone won't save him. His second mistake arrives in the form of a phone call to Patricia Whelan, one of 3 board members he'd carefully cultivated over the years. Patricia picks up on the 3rd ring. Ashford can hear the hesitation in her breathing before he even speaks. "We have a probationary nurse who performed an authorized surgery," Ashford says, his tone measured and factual. "Yes, she has military service, but that's exactly the problem. She thinks combat rules apply in a civilian hospital. The precedent this sets." Patricia's voice interrupts, cold as a scalpel. Thomas Brennan says she has 2 silver stars. The pause stretches. Ashford's hand grips the phone tighter. "Irrelevant to hospital protocol." Patricia hangs up without another word. The hospital corridors transform around him. What was once his domain, hallways where nurses stepped aside, where his voice carried absolute authority, now feels like a maze designed to trap him. By mid-afternoon, Captain Webb gets transferred to ICU for continued monitoring. Ashford approaches the room for routine evaluation, a perfectly normal action that would raise no questions, but Commander Price, a Navy SEAL officer in a borrowed hospital visitor's jacket, blocks the doorway with the immovable presence of someone trained in violence and restraint. The captain has requested no contact with staff involved in his care decisions, Price says flatly. That includes you. Ashford's voice rises slightly. I'm the chief of surgery. And I'm a Navy SEAL commander who watched you fire the woman who saved this man's life. Price's eyes carry the weight of having seen real consequences to real decisions. We're done here. Ashford retreats to find two FBI agents waiting at the nurse station like evidence made flesh. Agent Nicole Torres, 38, introduces herself with the kind of measured authority that comes from having arrested people who thought themselves untouchable. Her partner stands beside her with printed logs in his hands. Dr. Ashford, we need to discuss alterations to personnel records, Torres says. Hospital administration flagged unusual access to employee files using your credentials. His mouth goes dry. The words come out as if someone else is speaking them. I was updating performance documentation. You added 6 incident reports to Katie Rodriguez's file, backdated them, and modified her termination paperwork. Torres holds up the printed log showing every file he accessed, every field he changed, timestamps matching each keystroke. That's falsification of employment records. Potentially federal fraud given her military status and veteran protections. The hallway fills as if on cue. Sarah Chen stands with crossed arms. The ER physician who wanted Katie's help during the emergency. The day shift that heard his overhead page mocking her as the know-it-all newbie. They watch in silence as Torres's partner produces handcuffs with the kind of slow deliberation reserved for men who've built empires on institutional authority. Dr. Marcus Ashford, you're under arrest for falsification of federal employment records and obstruction of a veteran's rights investigation. The handcuffs click closed, a sound like finality itself, in front of the same board members he'd called as witnesses to Katie's termination. Thomas Brennan and Patricia Whelan stand motionless. The fluorescent lights hum their relentless frequency. He has walked past the employee entrance, past the parking lot where he humiliated Katie 3 days ago, while the arriving night shift stops mid-stride to watch him leave. That evening, Katie receives an official termination letter dated the same day: insubordination, unauthorized medical procedures, violation of scope of practice. The language is pristine. The logic is unassailable. The injustice is absolute. She returns to her apartment, a small 2-bedroom in northeast Portland with exposed brick and the kind of silence that comes from living alone with impossible knowledge, and pulls out her hospital badge, that blue credential that never quite fit anyway. The photograph shows her looking almost peaceful, the early days before Ashford's humiliations, before the parking lot dressing down, before the choice that cost her everything. That evening, Katie returns her scrubs to the hospital laundry facility in the basement, handling the blue fabric with the same precision she once used to fold a combat uniform. Her movements are mechanical and complete. She folds the top layer. Then the pants. Then the undershirt. Each fold is exact. Military corners. She places them in the bin marked "Terminated Staff, do not reissue." The weight of invisibility settles over her like dust that won't wash away. She has disappeared before. She can do it again. The drive home takes her past the hospital one last time. The building rises against the Portland night sky like a monument to institutions that break people for saving lives with the wrong paperwork. Rain hammers the windshield. She doesn't look in the rearview mirror. Her apartment is dark when she arrives. The laptop sits on her kitchen table exactly where she left it that morning. Katie opens a new document and begins typing: Major Katie Rodriguez, Army Ranger Medical Corps, discharged, seeking nursing position in rural or remote settings. Military medical experience. Trauma certification. Willing to relocate. The resume is lean and careful, revealing nothing, mentioning nothing of Kandahar or courts-martial or the 16 soldiers she kept alive under Taliban fire. She is already planning the next disappearance when her phone rings. Sarah Chen's voice comes through tight with emotion. Katie. They know who you are. Captain Webb woke up. He said your call sign, Viper. A SEAL commander is here. The FBI arrested Dr. Ashford for forging your records. Katie, they want you back. The administration is offering everything. New position. Director level. Katie, please. Katie sits in the silence, stretching between them like an uncrossable distance. I can't, Sarah, she finally says, her voice level. I can't go through this again. She hangs up and closes the resume. In the darkness of her apartment, the city lights of Portland filter through the windows. She remembers Kandahar. She remembers the courtroom where Captain Webb's signature ended her military career. She remembers the IED that shredded her leg and gave her a medical discharge she never wanted. She remembers rebuilding herself, piece by piece, in civilian clothes, with a civilian name, with a civilian life that never quite fit. The phone sits silent on her kitchen table. Outside, rain continues its relentless percussion against the windows. She stands and walks to her bedroom closet, moving aside hanging clothes to the very back, to the place where she keeps the things that matter. Folded with military precision sits an Army Ranger uniform she hasn't worn in 4 years. Beside it rests the faded unit patch, the one she'd sewn inside her jacket lining at Oak Creek Memorial, the same patch from the field hospital in Kandahar where everything changed. She reaches for it, and in that moment, Katie Rodriguez understands that some identities never truly disappear. Some names, even when whispered, carry the weight of legends. Some call signs, Viper, don't fade just because you've tried to become someone new. Her phone rings again. This time, the sound carries her toward something rather than away from it. Thank you so much for watching. If you're moved by Katie's story, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, please like this video, subscribe for more stories of hidden strength, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Katie's position? Would you have saved him or walked away? Let me know. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.